Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into what is, without a doubt, one of psychology's most infamous and, quite frankly, chilling moral dilemmas. We're going to unpack a foundational study that literally reshaped how we understand human nature, authority, and just how far our personal conscience can actually stretch.
So ask yourself this: would you electrocute a complete stranger just because someone in a lab coat told you to? Now, I know most of us instinctively think, no way, absolutely not, I'd never do that. But back in the early 1960s, a Yale psychologist named Stanley Milgram decided to test exactly that scenario. He wanted to measure, with actual scientific precision, just how far everyday ordinary people would go when following orders from an authority figure, even if those orders completely crossed the line of their own moral beliefs.
Taking a look at the original 1963 publication of his study, it's really important to know that Milgram's investigation was deeply rooted in the very dark history of the Holocaust. You see, he was trying to figure out a terrifying puzzle. How could millions of ordinary citizens, bureaucrats, and soldiers systematically participate in the slaughter of innocent people just because they were given a command? Was it some specific cultural defect, or is this capacity for blind obedience actually hiding inside all of us?
To figure this out, Milgram set up what looked like a totally standard, harmless lab experiment. He brought in 40 men from all walks of life, we're talking postal clerks, high school teachers, engineers, into an elegant Yale laboratory. They were given these specific rules and assigned the role of the teacher. But here's the catch: they had no idea the whole thing was completely staged. The drawing of lots? Rigged. The learner, who was strapped into an electric chair in the next room, actually a trained actor. And those shocks they were about to give? Totally fake.
Now imagine yourself sitting in front of this seriously formidable piece of equipment. This is the simulated shock generator Milgram custom built for the test. It had 30 lever switches lined up right in front of you, starting at a mild 15 volts on the left and escalating to a genuinely terrifying 450 volts on the right. And it was marked with these ominous labels, going from moderate shock all the way up to danger, severe shock, and finally, just a chilling red XXX. Oh, and to make it feel super real, they even gave each subject a real 45-volt shock before starting, just to convince them this machine meant business.
Section 1. Predictions versus chilling reality. So, before a single switch was ever flipped, Milgram wanted to get a baseline. He went ahead and surveyed 14 Yale senior psychology majors, along with psychiatrists and everyday adults, basically asking, hey, what do you think is going to happen here? The experts were super confident. They predicted that practically everyone would stop and refuse to go past 150 volts. That's the exact moment in the setup where the victim first explicitly demands to be let out. They figured maybe 1 or 2% might push it a bit further, and they swore that only a pathological, sadistic 1 in 1,000 would ever go all the way to 450 volts.
But man, here is the chilling reality. An absolutely astounding 65% of the subjects, that is 26 out of the 40 ordinary people they tested, they pulled every single lever. They administered the maximum 450-volt shock. By the time they reached that final dreaded switch, the actor in the next room had been screaming in absolute agony and eventually had fallen completely silent and unresponsive, basically mimicking unconsciousness or worse. And yet, the vast majority of people just kept right on shocking him.
Checking out the raw data from Milgram's original paper really drives this home. If you look at the bottom row here, it visually isolates this massive cluster of 26 participants who went all the way to the bitter end, despite hearing those screams. Out of everyone, only 14 people broke off before the end. And get this, not a single person stopped before reaching 300 volts. That's the exact point where the victim is literally frantically kicking on the wall.
Now, I want to be really clear about something. These subjects were not some sadistic monsters who were enjoying this. Not at all. They were ordinary folks who were experiencing extreme, agonizing emotional strain. People watching the experiment noted profuse sweating, trembling, and even subjects digging their own fingernails into their flesh. One of the most bizarre and unexpected reactions they saw was uncontrollable nervous laughter. Take a guy named Morris Braverman, for instance. He was a 39-year-old social worker, a totally serious, smart guy. But during the test, the sheer agonizing nervous tension made him laugh so hard he had to actually rub his face to hide it from the experimenter in charge. Honestly, 3 participants even had full-blown seizures just from the sheer stress of the situation.
Section 2. Defiance and agonizing submission.
To really wrap our heads around this, let's dive into the actual transcripts from the people in that chair, starting with what defiance looks like. Here is a powerful quote from Gretchen Brandt.
She was a 31-year-old medical technician who had emigrated from Germany. Now, when the learner in the other room started complaining about a heart condition, Gretchen firmly and coolly just refused to go past 210 volts. She straight up asserted her free will, looked the experimenter in the eye, and told him she absolutely would not be held responsible. She completely defied him to his face. Her absolute control and courteous behavior makes saying no look like this incredibly simple, rational choice.
But then, you have to contrast Gretchen with someone like Fred Progy. Fred was a 50-year-old unemployed man, and he was absolutely agonizing over this. He verbally rebelled. He was sweating profusely. He argued with the experimenter, desperately begging him to go check on the guy in the other room. He obviously knew deep down that what he was doing was wrong. And yet, despite all of his protests and obvious distress, he still mechanically pulled those levers, completely submitting all the way to the 450-volt mark. It's like he was completely trapped in the polite etiquette of submission. So how on earth did the experimenter actually get people like Fred to submit? It's kind of mind-blowing because he didn't threaten them, he didn't have a weapon, he couldn't fire them, he couldn't arrest them. All he did was use this strictly bureaucratic sequence of 4 very calm, matter-of-fact prods. Things like, please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. And finally, you have no other choice. You must go on. Just by using that specific language, he systematically stripped the subjects of their own sense of personal responsibility. When he stepped back and analyzed all of this, Milgram realized his findings perfectly mirrored the philosopher Hannah Arendt's famous concept of the banality of evil. Arendt wrote about Adolf Eichmann, pointing out that he wasn't some cartoonish, mustache-twirling villain, he was just a bureaucrat doing his job. Milgram's study pretty much confirmed this utterly terrifying truth. Horrific, destructive acts are very often committed not by people who are pure evil, but by completely average, everyday people who just feel obligated to do their duty and please whoever is in charge. Section 3. Manipulating the obedience variables.
Well, Milgram being Milgram, he didn't just stop there. He really wanted to know what exactly makes authority so incredibly potent, and more importantly, how easily can we break it down just by tweaking a few variables. By changing up the environment and the rules, we can actually see the mechanics of authority shift right in front of us. For instance, being at Yale University definitely gave the experiment prestige. When he moved the exact same setup to a shady, rundown office building, obedience dropped from 65% down to 47.5%. But look at that third bar. When the subject was seated right next to the victim and literally had to physically force the victim's hand onto a shock plate, obedience plummeted down to 30%. Although, it is still pretty wild to think that, like with a 37-year-old welder named Bruno Botta, some people still forcefully held a screaming man's hand down onto an electric plate simply because they were instructed to.
So, the really crucial takeaway here is that authority is actually incredibly fragile, depending entirely on how it's presented. The data clearly shows that if the experimenter simply walks out of the room and gives orders over the telephone, obedience tanks to 21%. In fact, a lot of subjects actually lied and gave lower shocks when the boss wasn't physically watching them. And my favorite part, if you have 2 authority figures sitting in the room and they start arguing, with one saying continue and the other saying stop, the subject's paralysis completely breaks and obedience absolutely evaporates to 0.
We also really get to see the immense power of our peers. When Milgram put the real subject in a room alongside 2 actors who were pretending to be fellow teachers, and those actors rebelled and refused to shock the victim, guess what? 36 out of 40 subjects immediately joined the defiance. Rebellion is incredibly contagious. But there is a very dark side to this, which is the chain of command. If the subject only had to read the word pairs out loud, while another actor was the one actually pulling the shock switch, a totally terrifying 37 out of 40 people became fully complicit in delivering the maximum voltage. It just shows that when we're only a tiny link in a larger chain, it is dangerously easy to just ignore our personal responsibility.
Section 4. Would we obey today? Now, right about now, you might actually be comforting yourself. You might be thinking, okay, well, that was the culturally obedient 1960s. We know better now. We absolutely wouldn't do that today, right? Well, in 2009, psychologist Jerry Berger published a very careful, ethical replication of Milgram's original study. Now, to protect the participants' mental health, Berger only tested 70 modern adults up to the critical 150-volt mark. That's the point of the first loud verbal protest. Since Milgram's old data showed that 79% of people who cross that 150-volt line end up going all the way to 450 volts, Berger realized he could safely estimate modern obedience without actually traumatizing anyone.
Let me tell you, the results of that 2009 study were incredibly sobering. The modern obedience rates were practically identical to Milgram's original data from 45 years earlier. And on top of that, there was absolutely no difference between men and women in their willingness to obey. It pretty much proves that human nature just hasn't fundamentally changed. Those innate psychological mechanisms that bind us to authority, yeah, they're just as strong today as they were back then.
Which really brings us to the core mechanism of exactly why this happens. As Milgram himself concluded, the true profound danger of obedience is that a critical shift in our viewpoint occurs. We literally stop evaluating the morality of our own actions. Instead, our sense of morality becomes entirely wrapped up in how adequately we are fulfilling our socially defined role. Basically, we stop judging ourselves on what we are doing, and we only judge ourselves on how well we follow the rules given to us by our boss, our commander, or our society.
We've seen the raw data, we've read the transcripts, and we've witnessed the terrifying power of just a lab coat and a clipboard. So, I'm going to leave you with this deeply uncomfortable question to ponder about your own life, your own workplace, and your own moral compass. If you were seated at that shock generator today, knowing everything you know right now, whose voice would actually be louder, your conscience or the authority in the room? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Stay curious and always keep questioning the world around you.